What's going on, YouTube? Today we're going to talk about the original gangster budget knife. The Rake, or Ruike, as Nick Shabazz calls it, P801. This is a knife that I saw on Cedric and Ada Outdoors. Pete from Australia. I saw it on his channel quite a while ago. There's a lot of talk about this knife and basically how it was like the best flipper for the money. And there's not much that I can argue away from that. It's a fantastic knife. It's fairly lightweight. It's still got some heft to it. The scales are what give it its weight. They're fairly thick. The action on it is really good. The detent especially for the price of this knife, it's fantastic. I mean, the flipping action on this thing, it's like ridiculous. You can push button, you can light switch it. Either way, it's gonna flip out. You can use the thumb studs, and you have to push pretty hard because the detent on it. The lockup on it is about 50%. Hasn't changed since day one, since I've had it. The detent on it is pretty hard. You can fail it, so that's what I'm doing right now, but you have to really try. This is actually a pretty tight pivot. If I were to loosen it up just a little bit, the action on it would get even better. But it does fall shut with one shake. I have the pivot right where I want it. I prefer to push button this rather than light switch it. The jimping on it is a little sharp, but I mean, for the price of this knife, you can't beat it. It is, I think, 8CR13. Oh no, this is 14C28N. So it's actually, in my opinion, a little bit better than 8CR or 9CR13 MOV, or I think it's 9CR14 MOV. It's pretty close to like a VG10. So the edge retention that you're gonna get on it is good. It's not great. It's like VG10. It does drop back really nicely. The edge that you get on it is pretty crisp. The burr can be a little bit of a pain. I find the Chinese knives, they're kind of a pain in the ass to deburr no matter what the steel is. D2, 14C28N. I think the 8C13 MOV is probably the easiest. But it's all pretty, it's all relative, I guess. But for the cost of this thing, no complaints. The blade stock is thin. They leave the tip a little bit more robust. I don't think it's gonna like break off for anybody, even if you did pry with it. I've beaten this up pretty good, and they do like this polished stone wash that we all know how the Chinese do. They do a nice stone wash on it, and it hides a lot of scratches. So there you can't even tell. But I mean, I've used this thing to pry. I've used it to actually scrape mortar out of a brick joint, or a mortar joint in brick. The tip was still intact. Obviously the edge was blunted where I did it. I'm trying to think what else I've done with this thing. That's probably the worst I've done with it. I wanted to see how far I could push the 14C28N because for this kind of knife, I just wanted to see how they did on the heat treat and stuff, and it's really forgiving. Takes an edge pretty quickly too. It's a fairly easy knife to sharpen. yeah, overall for the money, the rake knives, they do a good job. All the new, now this, when I got this, there was no Civivi, there was no, I don't even, maybe Tangram was around, but like none of the Chinese knives were really popular at that point. It was kind of at the time when like Ganzo was still really controversial, and the Chinese knives were like not really looked at like they are now. Like they didn't have the offerings like they do now. I think Rake is kind of one of the first anyways to build up like the EDC community's trust that they were giving a decent product for what it was. We all know this is not like a high-end folder, but what they do with the price point that they're offering, they do really well. The pocket clip's a deep carry pocket clip. The anodization on it, there's only like a couple spots where it's rubbed off, like on the corners, and I'm not really good to this knife, so for what it is, this thing's stayed in really good shape. It is a ball bearing flipper, and I haven't cleaned this thing in probably 3 or 4 months, and the action is still like perfect. I'm trying to think of what I can complain about on this knife. I guess the flipper tab angle is not the best, and it can be a little sharp on the sides. These are nitpicks. I'm not really even complaining about it. It's just like something that I can point out to you guys that you can expect. The other thing too, I guess, would be the angle of the transition. So where the stop pin is and this groove right here for where you're gonna flip to get onto the flipper, it's a little bit too far forward. Like I kind of wish they set it back just a little bit more, but I know why. It's because they needed that stop pin to stay where it was. So there you can see it. But obviously, since the stop pin is right there and the flipper tab, when it shuts, that's where it hits. So they needed it to be that way. So it's understandable. The centering on it out of the box is perfect. No matter how loose, but within reason. Like how sometimes you'll loosen your pivot and your centering just freaks out. This knife, that won't happen with, or at least with the one that I have. It's never happened. Obviously, like once you start taking it apart, the centering will come off. But to dial in the pivot, there was no centering issues. Like I was able to dial in the pivot the way that I wanted to, and tighten it as much as you want. If you want to tighten it all the way to its till you can't tighten it anymore, your centering should still be in line. And even if you back it off like almost a full thread, your centering, at least my example, the centering is still the same. So there is some forgiveness with that. I am running a lighter weight oil in this. I'm running Daiwa real oil in this. I usually run either Nano oil or the Daiwa oil. I did use Frog Lube for a little bit, but I like the Nano oil. It seems to work well for me. Oh, you know what? Let me do a quick size comparison. So this is the Rat Model 1, and these are close in size. The Rat one's bigger, obviously. It's probably like between the Rat 2 and the Rat 1, if you could split the difference of that. You do get a pretty long blade. The handles, I have a large to extra large size hand. They're a little skinny. If they were maybe just a little bit beefier, they'd fit my hand better, but they're trying to to have this knife apply to everyone. And the pocket clip, there I haven't had any hot spots, and I think the pocket clip is probably what helps me the most have this knife feel more comfortable. Is it gives like some girth to the handle, but the inside of the stainless steel here is a little bit sharp. It's not going to cut you obviously, but if you do have bigger hands, you may feel it more in here. If you have smaller hands, I think you probably your hand won't fit in the same spot as where mine does. So mine kind of hits like this second knuckle here, and that's where that sharpness kind of creates a little bit of a hot spot. Same with the jimping. The jimping's a little bit sharp, but for what the knife costs, no complaints. This is still just an awesome knife, the Rat One. Let's do a Para 3 comparison. So handles are basically about the same size as the Para 3. I'd say really like exactly the same, maybe an eighth of an inch longer, quarter of an inch longer. And then the blade length, you are going to get more blade out of the rake. It's probably like 3/4 of an inch more, half an inch more roughly. And last but not least, the Griptilian. And it's almost identical to the Griptilian too. The Griptilian has a little bit longer of a handle, but the blades are essentially the same. And if you line up, let's see, line up the blade on top of the blade. So maybe like an eighth of an inch or quarter of an inch more on the rake, but I'd say it's really, really close. Alright guys, yeah, so the Rake P801 in my opinion is, well, it's my OG budget flipper. It's the first budget flipper I've ever gotten. It's one of the best. When you compare it with what was offered a year ago or 2 years ago and what's offered now, it's night and day. Like like I was saying, there's no Civivi. There's about half the budget lines than there are now. Ganzo was really like the only other thing that was offered at the time that was like okay, but Ganzo was getting a ton of hate at the time that I picked this thing up. So Rake was basically the only option that didn't seem like I'd be wasting my money on it. And even Ganzo I think has come a long way, or the knife community has just accepted it more. But the Rake P801, you really can't go wrong, especially for the money. It's one of the best. It's one of the best budget flippers, and even money aside, it's a really good flipper. It's got great action, good steel, deep carry pocket clip. But for the money, you can't get much better than this thing. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this video. This is Mike with I Heart Knives. Thanks for coming along on this one. Please give it a thumbs up or thumbs down, whatever. Comment, subscribe if you already haven't. Can't thank you guys enough for your support. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks.